Welcome to this exploration and guide to ultra-modern wargaming. So I'm going to lay out the benefits of either starting or adding to your tabletop wargaming hobby in the ultra-modern setting. I'm going to give tips and advice on how to do that and explain the benefits as well and why I think it's good, and also show a few of the ideas and options that are out there. So first thing to say is that ultra-modern wargaming has tended to be classified slightly different by different people. Now, I'm going to classify and focus on ultra-modern wargaming from the angle of playing with forces that are representative of either now, the near past from now, or the near future from now. Some people class ultra-modern wargaming either post-World War II or the Great Patriotic War, and equally they also sometimes move the timeline up to past the Cold War and into around the early 90s. Some people mark it exactly around Mogadishu issues with the US, so we're talking 1993, the whole Black Hawk Down incident and so on from the Ridley Scott movie. So, like I say, I'm going to focus on essentially today, near future, near past, what ifs mostly. The main pitfalls to ultra-modern wargaming, and once you get past them, really the world's your oyster and you realise how great the saying is. So the two pitfalls, and it's just simply because it's based on military of relevance today, is one, classification. So what do I mean by that? So military equipment having classified capabilities or properties or parameters to them. This doesn't necessarily help with statting out your units. There's always going to be a lot of guesswork. Some things are clearer than others. Some things have decent, reliable examples of how they perform in the battlefield. But to be sure, major militaries around the world, even if they don't disclose the full figures, certainly keep a lot of data on military assets that they put out into actual real battlefields. If military assets go into the theatre of war, especially if it's outside of low intensity combat, the data certainly comes back and you can learn from what they do disclose. The second with that is propaganda. Now, this isn't actually a political statement, because you can probably guess my goal is to give you an exploration and introduction to ultra-modern tabletop wargaming, not some kind of political commentary. The reason why I'm bringing up propaganda with ultramodern particularly is that it's most relevant today, so therefore the propaganda is most frequent. It's also the least unravelled. So for instance, even World War II, much of the propaganda or opinions have been accurately revised so to something closer to the truth from a military aspect today, because we've had enough time between then and now. Whereas propaganda now is a benefit, or seen as a benefit, to those that create it or even forward it without realizing that it's propaganda. They think they're reporting on accurate information. So where do these fall into play? Essentially, you need to listen to both sides. So most gaming systems are often going to have, if they're a decent rule system that also comes with decent research, and that's not always the case. Sometimes you get good rule systems that don't necessarily have or claim to have realistic research for the units, and that's fine. You can adapt it to your taste, or you can just play it as is. But if you do want to double check or create your own stats or validate unit statistics, or you think it's not quite right for your own tastes or understanding and research, then ultramodern is definitely the place to spend that energy. You won't end up going too far wrong compared to what most of these rule designers are creating, because of the mix of propaganda and classification on units. So it touches everything, but the best way to do it is see both sides, see both salesmen on capabilities of units, and observe actually perform where it's publicized. And where it is publicized, you need to make sure, again, the publication itself is not propaganda and exaggerated failures or successes of certain things. Tends to be on the exaggerated failures of certain things. This was where the heaviest propaganda comes these days. Although I'm going to give you a few real-world examples just now, just to end the point on this, and I'll move on. So I'll do a point from some familiarity as I'm an English speaker. I'll give you some examples from the Cold War era on the NATO side. So anti-tank guided weapons started to build up their popularity in the 1970s and 80s, and they were heavily pushed, and they certainly make a difference in ground warfare. But when certain simulations were carried out, things like the terrain were modified in some of these situations in professional war games, and this can be seen in a lecture that I was listening to online about professional wargaming. And what was happening is that they were trying to push the anti-tank guided weapons within the simulation rather than just let them play out, because they certainly had their own capabilities and they would shine in their own way without massaging the parameters of the simulation. But nonetheless, they felt that they had to fiddle with them. So what did they fiddle with? They took things out like, or conveniently forgot things like overhanging power cables and telephone cables, which, if you're setting your terrain up as East and West Germany during a big Cold War push, then obviously that plays a massive factor. There in built-up areas, they're incredibly dense, and even in small towns, there's a lot of those. And yeah, the terrain always becomes a problem with a lot of these things. In real life. So there we go. So there's a simple example. On the other end, I'll just mention something about clarity. And again, I'm actually just sticking. Again, you'll notice these examples are actually from the Cold War, so they're not even recent examples I'm deciding to give here. So that just tells you how thick the propaganda goes, and how it's important to keep track on both sides. So of whatever forces there are, whatever country you happen to dwell in. So the second example would be the reverse of this. Actually, some insight. So the U.S. Army, there's a Gulf War exaggeration of what happens if the US Army assets fight against a peer competitor, and sometimes people have propagated the example of the First Gulf War as some sort of indicator, which is always been considered a fringe military campaign and not really representative of much other than in and of itself. So you can kind of learn what would happen if a US-style force was to fight against that exact kind of set of parameters. It's hard to glean lots of stuff. Now, there are certain examples that can be taken from the First Gulf War, but they are not large data sets, and it's more fringe elements of what was going on in that campaign, especially from the American side if you're trying to glean information against more capable or technologically advanced militaries. So they, after the Cold War, meaning the US Army, got hold of Contact 5 explosive reactive armour, which was a revolutionary addition to composite armour that laid over it for the Soviet Union at the time. And that gave the US Army, in around 1997, in a report in a Jane's journal, gave them the opportunity to test weapons of that era. So we're talking 1984 onwards, really. And they were testing weapons of that era and also more modern weapons. And then they could find out, okay, what weapons designs was the explosive reactive armour working with, and how did it work along as overlays on composite armour. And they've also found that the armour could be appropriately laid over older tanks effectively. And so they would shoot at older tanks with this explosive reactive armour laid over it, and they'd be able to test what would happen if a Soviet force started to roll out the armour, because of course the Cold War went hot in their example, and they found that it was effective. So it made a major difference, and it levelled the playing field effectively into exchanges between armoured units. So that was of its time. Now obviously, off the back of that as well, they can analyse how that explosive reactive armour works and what its limitations are and levels of added protection, and then they could design around it so that it could be defeated more effectively by more vast range of weapons. And so the military industrial complex goes on major forces around the world, and tit for tat. Within the Russian Federation today, they've made more advanced explosive reactive armours than were in the past. So there we go. So that's an example of insight and reality kicking in. Now, with ultra-modern wargaming, there are ways of playing it. Because we're talking historical backdrop or real reality-based backdrop, you want to think about what level of granularity are you going to play your game at. So what I've started here in front of you is 3 examples of lower level smaller engagement rule systems. And we're going to start from left to right. Now I'm going to give a bit of explanation between them. Different systems claim different levels of realism. And this is purely up to them to make that claim. As I said before, even if they claim realism, always double check. And we shall get to a rule system that's held in high regard by a very reputable company that will say exactly the same thing in a different way, but I'll explain it when we get to it. So to start with, from left to right, we have, by Osprey Games, Black Ops. So this is an interesting one. This focuses in on what you would call the fire team to squad level. So what do I mean by when I say fire team to squad? So squad, think of as typically about 1/4 of a platoon. So imagine around 10 people. A fire team might be between, say, 5 and 3 people, depending on who's military and what's going on. This is focusing on, as it says here, tactical espionage. So the tactical espionage type game is absolutely perfect for military intelligence, tier 1 special forces operations, for special forces operations in low intensity conflict. You could adapt it to that. I think it'd also be great for sabotage. But yeah, its main role is essentially espionage. So what's that? Information gathering. And it tends to be leaning on the Hollywoodized fictional version of that. I actually think when you look at it, it's good enough. Play a serious war game if you're into your historical accuracy or your realism. It will do. There are near future gadgets for a techno thriller game. But having said that, you keep hold of this book for another 30 years and you might find that, again, it works appropriately as a abstracted version of what becomes ultra modern at the time of playing it in 30 years in the future. So it all depends how you take it. But overall, it's quite unique and interesting, the fact it actually focuses on the espionage. Intelligence, blurring the lines with military are certainly a very real thing and have been that way and heavily developed since the Cold War. So even more so in modern era. Next, we then come to Ultra Combat Modern. So this is, as it's saying, going up to skirmish level. So this is a game that has 3 modes of play, and it can be played at the fire team level, which is more close to the Black Ops game that I was showing, and then it can go up to the squad level, and then finally it can go up to the platoon level, and more specifically to a typical small reinforced platoons. So you might have an infantry fighting vehicle and some fire support in play. Now, this is zooming right in more to a military engagement where the casualty rate, especially in cover, is of a type of realism that I would associate with either low intensity combat or a part of a high intensity theatre where we're not into peak casualties levels. So why do I make that distinction? I think, as we'll see the next game, which actually isn't intended to be realistic, like real life, ultra modern setting, because of the destructive capability of weapons and because of operations having like a prep and build time that's quite diverse and quite long. So the replacement or the gathering of forces takes great logistics, and as I say, we're well beyond what we've learnt from World War II and the way things would go with competitors in hopefully fictional wargaming battles only and not real life, that you get a lot of swingy casualty rates across the campaign. And so I would place this between low to medium casualty rates for most games. More on the conservative side where you're hunkered down in terrain and there's a chance to have a bit of an exchange over some time of firefights among infantry. So that's Ultra Combat Modern, and that is usually very popular. And then moving over to Battlefield Evolution Modern Combat. Now this claims, like the Black Ops really is claiming to be super spy techno thriller, this claims to be inspired by first person shooters like Battlefield. So combined arms, first-person shooter experiences. In reality, I would say reinforced platoon up to company level wargaming, and I would describe it very much as the effect of high intensity combat, although somewhat removed from the effects of strategic strikes. It's certainly well within the realms of high intensity combat. So despite the fact that they were going for a unrealistic attempt, the rule system at its core, if you certainly if you tweak the stats of the units, are very representative of a high casualty rate, high intensity combat engagement. So if you're looking for one-to-one infantry, one-to-one vehicle, and you can either choose larger scale models down to smaller scale, this game is very good if you want to play a particularly bloody or high casualty rate game. You can have entire armies wiped out in the space of a couple of turns in this game, which is a type of realism that does happen. We have that. Now what we can look at is scaling up. And as you scale up a little bit more than this is where we tend to get into some of the really more representative wargaming systems that resemble the types of identification miniatures like micro armor and pico armor that militaries would have used. Now we have Sabre Squadron, we have Hind Commander, which is an interesting game, we'll get to that. We have an old reliable, as I call it. We have Micro Armor's modern game, which is very good. You can play post World War II or even late World War II very well with this game, not just the ultra modern that I'm focusing on. And then finally, and it takes 2 books because one wasn't enough, we have Op 4 2nd edition, which uses the Panzer Corps rule system. So what have we got here? So let's start with Sabre Squadron. So now we're firmly in the company level of wargaming systems. So this is the upper end of what you would have played in Battlefield Evolution Modern Combat, and it's more comfortable with having a company or 2 of miniatures, and you can start playing with smaller scale miniatures, and it covers, as it says here, up to the digital age. So we're in the digital age, we're well within territory of us playing games. So you're going to have a definite focus on things like electronic warfare and so on, and you're going to be able to bring in your combined arms forces, and you can zoom out a bit on some of your potential strategic weaponry affecting your overall battle. So we have that. So going back, I touched on at the beginning of the video, classification and propaganda. This system is fantastic, it's detailed, it's one-to-one, but now we're at company level. Great system. What's the downside? NATO bias. This one, unfortunately, if you're playing right up to today with Digital Age, be careful on the stats of some of the vehicles, they don't make sense. So if you want the latest all singing, all shining technology from your PLAs, your Russian federations, be a bit careful. So we tend to be stuck in the 90s with this one. A little bit confusing, but it doesn't take much to tweak it. It's more of a conservative, we'll call it quote unquote realistic system. So they tend to stay back on just how much flavour they add into some of these units. So for instance, I don't know, main gun firepower values are just a number. So you can tweak that number and you can tweak the points a little bit. You can adjust to your own flavour. I would say that the NATO stuff is probably quite a good place on this one, so at least that's a lot of stats done right. So there you go. So that's that. There's my opinion, but again, that's the tip for that system. Then next we have a game that's probably not as widely known. This is written by a great guy from Poland, and this is focusing, Hind Commander focuses on not just Hind, it doesn't just equate to the Soviet Union there. This is actually modern helicopter warfare, so it goes all the way up to your ultra moderns. The game system itself is multi-force all over the world, so it's not just Eastern Europe. This is a game of forward recon and forward strike, where the helicopter gunships are the focal point and the view of the battlefield, and it's all about recon and suppressing forward forces and neutralizing them. So it's that classic push and pull when the air defence systems have been degraded enough to bring in your very modern helicopter gunships, and it certainly leans towards the idea that your helicopter gunships want self-contained EMC, so electronic countermeasures. Now, because this company, the Assault Publishing company, wanted to make a second edition of this, and they've had problems with because they're only a small group, they've had problems with their overall organisation and keeping the funds going. They haven't managed to create a second edition yet. That was their plan. So, as they even say in the book, some of the stats for your helicopters won't be in here. Because things are moving so quickly, most of the base models are in here. For instance, there's a K-52 in here. There's a newer version of an Apache, but there's not the latest version or the latest version of the Mi-28. So there's not an Mi-28 NM. There's enough difference between an Mi-28 NM to an Mi-28N where you want to start tweaking the stats. You need to start thinking about putting the ECM values up. You've suddenly got major additions to the armament that potentially that helicopter could take in your helicopter squadrons. So you have a mix of ground forces. They often recommend playing this in 3mm, and because the idea is you're going across the wide front in a recon and strike situation. So it's quite a unique system. It's really good. It's something unique. It might not appeal to everyone, but it's a lot easier actually to collect for, because you're just getting a couple of bunch of helicopters, and then everything else are essentially small strike forces as far as the figure count, dotted around the map, and you're going after them essentially. So then that brings us to zooming out even more. So now we're getting into the realms of company up to brigade level. So we're talking probably between company, battalion and brigade here with modern micro armor. So in the case of this game, we take one vehicle on a base, that would represent 10 vehicles, give or take. One infantry stand, a platoon. So we're looking at element-based system here. Although interestingly, for the fixed-wing aircraft and the helicopters, especially because they realise the destructive power of these if they're allowed to operate and strike out at the opposition effectively, they have a lot of firepower in the air, of course, their superiority as we call it. So they're one-to-one. So what's useful about this, even though this actually hasn't been revised or had statistics added to it, they had a few what-ifs that they put on the massive tables of equipment on here for all the various forces. So they've got a few what-ifs that can easily be sidelined into things that did actually get rolled into various militaries, which is great. And they actually provide so GHQ here actually provide the formulas to create your own units, which is great. They actually provide the mathematical formula. So going back to that propaganda classification, as you may or may not be able to decrypt those things, they've left the door open for you to be able to recalculate and also adjust the points, because we don't want to have potentially, unless you're playing scenario based, uneven forces and you end up making a mess of it yourself. So that's great. We've got that to play here. It's got all the various things you could imagine, artillery spread patterns and goodness knows what. Very detailed game. You're playing typically with, if you're playing with their range of models, it's 1 to 285th scale, which is known as the micro armor scale, which is slightly bigger than the 6mm, which is 1 to 300th scale that you may be more familiar with, so smaller scale models. So 285th scale was the original small scale that the US Army was using, and then the NATO standard became this 1 to 300 scale, this 6mm scale that we're familiar in wargaming, that's actually taking a back seat now. It seems that 10 to 12mm is becoming the new 6mm, so we're getting a bit of scale creep out in the miniature space these days, but there you are. That could easily be played with 10mm models. I think that personally that GHQ's own model range, which is vast, are fantastic. They are super high detail, and that 1:285 scale is very nice for identification of your units while remaining having a small representative marker of your game. So the best way to think of it, if you remember the old hex and counter war games, the playing pieces are a bit like how the hex and counters are represented on those often. So, you know, you just got a picture of one tank on it if it's not just a symbol, and the one tank will be represented by one model tank. So there are good suggestions I've heard out there actually, which is, although I think it would break the basing system that it claims in here, but as long as you have all the same bases, it is going to slightly change the game, but you still get a great game out of it. Is the use of Pico armor, which I will come to with the final rule system that I'm going to show here. But essentially, Pico armor is 3mm, so we're going down again smaller so than the NATO standard of the 6mm. We're going right down to Pico armor at 3mm, and what that allows you to do is put multiple units on a base, on a single base. Now you could start getting into 1-to-1, so where one tank was represented by 10, you could put 10 tanks on the base. Pico armor typically sells in 15 models for vehicles in one pack. So you buy 2 packs, you get 3 bases worth of models for 1-to-1. The only downside to this, although I personally don't think it's that much of a problem, in that, as we've seen, depending on which force that's actually fighting in real life or potential forces, just because tables of equipment that we are overly complacent or look back to the Cold War era have certain numbers, the way all of the various forces support each other now and the way precision strike is becoming more and more deadly, and time to target is more faster with faster target acquisition, massing up armor, for instance, and so on, is a lot more variable, and supporting infantry or mechanized forces with larger armor is again more variable and more adaptable when it comes to making forces that you can deploy out there. So we're really back to that World War II. You can get away with most things, but you tend to start, when you start building up from, say, platoons up to companies or squadrons of tanks, you will start thinking in command tanks and regular tanks, and getting into your 15s for your NATO forces, and maybe your 9s for Soviet forces. So you end up sometimes not symmetrical with 10 for a base. You're left with halves, for instance. You can't have half a base. But it's minor. It really doesn't matter. And you can just use the right division of units to get back to your table of equipment level numbers of forces. So that's that. Highly recommend this, and as I say, easily adaptable for anything that comes out of the woodwork in today's military forces. And then finally, something really unusual is ultra modern, all the way up here, look, to that claims 2030 for the corp level. And in fact, this can actually go all the way up to army scale. So this actual game is having combat engagements at divisional level. So what do I mean by this? So whereas we had one element, so one model or a set of models on a base was equaling around 10 models, something like that, we absolutely definitely have it now down to where you have one tank, for instance, I'm just using an example, or say one artillery piece will equal a company. And then when we get up to about 3 of those companies that are representative, we get up to a formation. So we're now playing at formation levels. So we're not counting exact numbers anymore, playing at the formation level, which is really handy, because once we start abstracting that brings in a type of realism itself in that regard, because we're talking at more of an operational level and more of a entire battle or major engagement level. Now, to go through things, because we're talking at divisional combat, we're talking about 3 brigades worth. So 3 brigades is going to be between 10 and 15,000 soldiers, and that's going to include all your support and everything, but with all their equipment. So this is why this is for major engagements. You can actually, as I say, theoretically field an entire army with this. Upsides and downsides. Upside is you don't need lots of models to play battles. And believe it or not many wargamers ever play battles. They talk about battles and armies, but really they're playing skirmishes for the most part, even if they think they've put a big force out. Is it even a full engagement? Especially when we come to historical battles. Quite a tragic thought, really, isn't it? But there we go. Now, in contradiction to what I've just said, modern warfare, because of the lethality, you tend to have battles that can stretch over wide fronts, and you tend to have this variation in intensity across the front, and you don't necessarily now be moving large formations right into contact all at once. It's more spread out, it's more micromanaged. So you can end up, if you play a large game of this, accidentally playing a ultra-modern game as if you were in World War II, which, depending on how you scale the game out from how much ground is being covered, and there is, of course, a representative of how much ground is being covered in this, and how much time this battle goes on for, you may end up removing yourself right into unreality while thinking you're playing a very serious war game, because it's simply you just don't have an engagement that big and that clustered and that focused in a small geographical area, because it can potentially create disastrous effects for your amassing of forces. They can be neutralized with a lot less resources than what you've put in. So with that in mind, this is a great game, but be careful of how you use it. It covers all the way up to 2030. Now, back to the propaganda element. Fantastic detail, amazing World War II system that it's based on. This is a second edition, so they've actually gone in, tweaked the game even further. I have the first edition on my shelf. It was brilliant as it is. This has got some further great tweaks. But nonetheless, this great games designer has fallen prey. We have a section for breakpoints, and they've put down hard numbers for essentially morale levels for different nations. There are nations that I'm very skeptical at their adjusted morale levels. They have actually dropped morale levels from first edition of major fighting forces around the world. And those fighting forces have proven themselves to have a morale level that isn't lower than some of these forces. Because if you think about it, this is under, considering we are talking divisional combat level, peer competitors in a divisional combat situation and above. So to be clear, division, we're talking 15,000 soldiers, and we're talking multiple divisions in a big game of this. So we're going up to corps, hence the name with a K, corps, but corps with a C. We're now talking 20 to 45,000 soldiers. So if you think about conflicts around the world where you've got, shall we say, ultra-modern forces fighting against each other, where they're putting in forces of 45,000 to 50,000 troops in a major battle engagement, we've got a lot of unknowns here. We've got nations that haven't committed forces like that against a peer competitor or a near peer competitor in real life. We have no precedent. So how can you say that their morale and their breaking levels are of certain types? You can't, because it's unproven. So it comes down to media. So it's media perception. And so you may want to adjust the numbers. Now again, what's happened is they've created a fantastic table. They've listed out, they've given their opinion, their guide, tweak the percentages, crack on, play, talk to your gaming community and discuss it. Do we agree with the game designer? Maybe, I'm talking rubbish. Maybe no. Some of the forces that are unproven would definitely go in with higher morale than forces that have engaged with 45,000 troops against 45,000 troops that are also equipped to ultra-modern standards. It's a rare thing in history, thank goodness. But there we go. And we're talking of recent time, by the way. So when I'm talking this, I'm talking about morales that are going like beyond 2010. We're talking about morales that are going into today. So values representative of 2024. So this is the context I'm talking in. I'm not talking morale values going back to 1965 here, which you could probably come up with something somewhat sensible, especially if you realise, well, there is no room for major peer technological conflicts. You might have like a Vietnam War where there's a disparity, unless you're talking about Vietnamese assets that have been influenced by the Soviet advisors, for instance, where you might have a closer technological gap, but still the US are overwhelmingly advanced in, say, the Vietnam War. But yes, you get up to the what ifs, your 2030s, totally different ball game. So yes, you very much have to do your own research. So there's a great rundown of all these various systems. There are many more out there. There are some fantastic asymmetrical skirmish games coming out. So I'm going to recommend a YouTube channel that does a much better job than me at going through ultra-modern games, and they also go back into more historical style campaigns. So they're very much in the world of modern to ultra modern. So they'll play your World War Ones, your World War Two. So the dawn of modern combat, more historically accurate. That's why they go back to World War One, because they take it very serious. And that's the SITREP podcast. So I think some of them are military veterans themselves from the US. Again, I bet some of them have way different takes to me on this subject. But that's the beauty of it. That's why I'm recommending them, because there you go. You've got some people there that are passionate about it, and I know certainly one of their viewpoints that's very good is if you go back at campaigns that have been fought, like when I mentioned the Gulf War, those ones have been decided and they weren't peer competitors and the latest technology wasn't being used, even though the setting is more recent. But yes, so whereas my focus here is specifically about near peer and peer competitors going forwards, and more of a realistic edge, not a we think we are well trained, we think we are well prepared, we think our military has certain capabilities, what happens in the clash? And that is where the fun comes in, because you detach yourself from reality, you play the game with as best of the information you can get, and you find a system, as I say, that gives you the type of outcome that you're looking for in your game. And so that's why I start talking about what scale of game you're playing, whether you're playing, as I say, different intensities, whether you want your game to be killy or less killy, and that's down to the flavour of what you think. And so you will often get studies that will show casualty rates, but there is so much real life stuff that plays into your casualty rates that is there really a real answer? And maybe that's the fun of this setting. Maybe that's the great thing. It's a real exploration of something that you could always be enjoying and tweaking and playing something new with. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope that I'm going to finish up, and we'll just bring this one into field. We're just going to go through the sizes of forces. So a squad, about 6 to 10 soldiers. I'm just going to use this based off of a US Army readout, because it will do. It will do for most nations. So about six to 10 soldiers. Your larger forces, your US armies, your Russian federations, they're typically going to be on your 10 soldier size. Whereas maybe something like where I'm from, United Kingdom, I'm from England, we might have squads of 7. We might start talking about sections and so on, because we got lot smaller military, a lot smaller logistics footprint that we're capable with. So you can actually play with that. Why not make it unrealistic? Pretend the United Kingdom and France and Germany, they've got decent economies and they build up a war machine, because detach from real life, have fun with it. Why not? I mean, ultra modern combat actually focuses on that. It says, imagine everything rearms and militarizes. You have military economies that function for the various forces, and just gives you an excuse to have different flavors of factions and armies on the table. It just looks nice on the table and as a bit of fun. So don't take it seriously. That's the thing. You don't have to take it seriously. The best thing to do if you want to take it seriously is, let's play the Falklands. Okay, then we know what happens. We can take a battle from it and try and reconstruct it, and there you go. But yeah, so we have a squad, 6 to 10 soldiers. We have a platoon, so that tends to be about 3 to 4 squads. So somewhere between 18 and 50 soldiers. And 50 soldiers is a fantastic kind of explanation for something like the PLA. So you could have extended platoons, really large platoons, where they go up to the classic US Army, 40 soldiers in a platoon, and they extend it a bit out to that 50 because they've got such large numbers. So there we go. So maybe you get a platoon of PLA and you put 50 soldiers in it. So that's interesting. Company or battery or troop. Battery you might have for your artillery there, and that's 3 to 4 platoons. So if it's in soldier form, we're talking about 60 to 200 soldiers. So it's quite variant there. So a lot of these games, as I was saying, the middle ground, they sort of, a lot of them converge on company level warfare. So that sort of scale tends to be what most people play at when they get off of what they call skirmish. They tend to leave the platoon level and go up to the company. And once we get above company, this is where it's more rare. It's for tabletop ultra modern military games where you can go up to your battalion level. So now you're talking 3 to 5 companies, 100 to 1,000 soldiers involved there. And then as we keep going up, we have a brigade or regiment. So we're now about 3 to 5 battalions, so we're 2 to 5,000 soldiers. And we go up even further into division. So that was that game that I showed at the end, Op 4. And Op 4 was at the divisional combat level. So that was 3 brigades, and we're talking 10 to 15,000 soldiers there as an estimate. And then that system, when it really went up to a large game, it was designed, although the combat was at that level, it was designed to have on the table a whole corps. And now we're starting to build up entire blocks of what makes up someone's national army. And this is 2+ divisions, 20 to 45,000 troops. And then right at the end, we're talking about a whole army that you could put out in the field. And the example here, it's using Desert Storm. There are 1991, I mentioned it a couple of times, and that was 50,000 plus soldiers. And you'd have a 4-star general in overall command there. So yeah, 50,000 plus soldiers. We're talking there, like a field army. We're talking there about what's like a major European nation could put out in the field. Because I think the British Army is probably around 100,000, but how many could they really put out in the field? Probably about 50 to 70k. So there we go. There'll be the whole of a nation's army there in one go, and that gives you an idea of the scale. So what scale, what intensity, how realistic do you want to claim it is going to be? And then finally, it's the scale of models. So I'll close on this. I'll say I very much love 6mm and micro armor scale, the 285 to 1 scale. As I say, for ease of identification, and you still can see the detail on some of the larger assets. The aircraft look beautiful in it, very nice. But if you want to go really heavily into the realism and you actually like the scaling of the units to real life, then Pico armor is your place. I've always been a bit frightened of 3mm infantry and sort of understanding what you're looking at. I would think something like an MBT, especially a modern one, because they're noticeably bigger than your World War II tanks of the time. You can probably eyeball those. See their silhouettes on an element base, so you can start 1-to-1 there. So maybe next I'll talk about some model suppliers, and I'm going to start doing some battle reports of this, because before I did an introduction to military science fiction, so in that case it was the Hammer Slammers, so I've done a 4 video set on that. So maybe I could do some either introductories or do some battle reports, different scales for ultramodern, so you get a feel of what I'm talking about, and it might help things click if I've been a bit confusing to what I'm explaining. But anyway, have a great time, and like I say, SitRat podcast is probably the best ultramodern YouTube channel out there that I've stumbled across. Some people do one-off examples, like I've seen people do tutorials on playing modern Micro Armor the game. So there's resources I'd recommend. Now for a pick of starting with ultramodern, where would I start? So all of those game systems I actually probably wouldn't say are the best to get going. I've actually picked a rule system here for you all. So here's a little bit of a life hack for getting into ultramodern wargaming, and I'll explain why. So we have this book here, Use Me for Modern Warfare. Now, why is this good? It comes in about £3.50. So that's one good thing. It's very cheap on the wallet and get going. It was originally designed for 15mm to 20mm scale. I absolutely think it plays brilliantly on 6mm. 6mm on bases, not a problem. You can absolutely play it. It comes with solo play. That's a fantastic bonus. You don't always get solo play in these ultra modern rule systems. So there it is, right out of the book. It has all of the forces in there, and it has some advanced rules. Even though it's a tiny book, they've stuffed advanced rules in here. The reason why this is good is it has great mechanics, like some of the more detailed advanced games that I've shown already on the table, at a lot less price point to get into the rule system. But it doesn't make big sweeping choices on who's got the best equipment amongst the more capable militaries on Earth. Why is that useful? In doing that, sitting on the fence, it has a type of realism in of itself for playing ultramodern, where both sides manage to have a manufacturer base, manage to bring a trained and modern reflection of their technologies to the battlefield. So by keeping it somewhat even Stevens and just having generic special abilities, you get a great game out of it that has that nice balance between low intensity and high intensity casualty rates. You don't have to start getting into the overly subjective, and you don't have to start getting into the weird lag of having unit profiles from the past against unit profiles of the true present. That is all dispensed with, and you get a very much feel for other games. So in a lot of ways, you can get almost a Sabre Squadron experience out of this little £3.50 Use Me game. With less tweaking, just chuck it on the table. You know that all your friends that are constructing forces, they're not going to accidentally, I don't know, if you're playing an advanced military force, I don't know, an India on the border against some terrorist insurgency that's just using really out of date equipment, some old, I don't know, surplus Soviet era equipment, then with this you might be in a good place to get the scaling right. With this on the other end, it's focusing more on even Stevens, so you're not going to accidentally come in with a force that's half the model count as it should be, and they just get completely blown off the table and you don't have an enjoyable time. You might have recreated a realistic scenario with mismatched forces, but you could easily calculate that wrong as a beginner. So Use Me Modern Warfare is my recommendation to get started in the hobby, because you can just dip your toe into this, play this, but you may never ever leave this game, because there is really great mechanics for all the initiative, and it actually has a tech level, much like the Micro Armor game, which is fantastic. When you see a tech level for modern warfare games, go there, because it's a fantastic way of tweaking and retweaking your forces, because it's a great way of representing, well, what's the overall system's capability. If you up the tech level, you typically tend to be first to fire in the initiative order, and that's a major factor. Since the 70s, that was always said, he who shoots first wins, and that's kind of mostly true in ultramodern, but not an ironcast rule. But I think you're all smart enough, we're all smart enough to know, even if the target is not destroyed but hit, because of what we're talking about, it can greatly decrease their combat capability for various reasons, technological, and also what happens to the poor people that are targeted with these things. So that's that. Going back to Hex Encounter, now some Hex Encounter games might be absolutely fantastic to use as a replacement for a tabletop war game, and there is no reason why you can't take something like the micro armor range and actually replace it with your counters and just play it on your hex maps, and even maybe put some 3D terrain on them to represent that vibe of playing tabletop miniature games, where you're sort of a halfway house. In science fiction, something like that might be BattleTech, where it's adapted to both. So I'm just going to mention a couple of really good systems. One is going to be indicative of the ultramodern that I'm talking about, and another one is an honourable mention for those that want to play Cold War Gets Hot and wants really good accuracy on the statistics and the advanced rules. If you want to go, okay, I don't have to worry about the author getting some of their research and a bit out, and it all gets a bit Team Yankee novels, then I recommend the following. So the first recommendation is Armageddon War, and this really is great for what happens if the Middle East, oh my goodness, and isn't this a scary, considering we're in 2024, a scary thought. This is what happens in the Middle East, very much post our own timeline. It's frightening, because I suppose you could have always talked about it, because the Middle East has always been a hot spot in real life for modern warfare. But think of a post-Syria and a post-unfortunate Ukraine conflict, talking about today, although I know Syria is in some ways ongoing, but it's an interesting situation. But imagine a post that, and we have the nations coming in as rivals in the Middle East, with tensions brewing up, and so we're getting your nations that would oppose your US, Israeli arm, and you're having your more technologically advanced nations from the Islamic world mixed in with your Russian federations and so on. Scary thought, but there has been a game released for it, so that's a great what if. And say it's platoon level, and it contains military equipment of today and the very near future. So it doesn't go too leery with some of the flights of fantasy on what equipment would be out there. So that's good for your true ultra modern near future that I talked about for Hex Encounter. And there's certainly models out there that you can have for all of the various playing counters that are used in that. And then finally, something that's very realistic, as I say, that I'm so impressed with is MBT. So there was a game long ago in the past that was under the same name, MBT, but this is the MBT by GMT Games, and specifically you want to play the advanced rules. If you really want a late Cold War, they pick a sensible date, 1987. I think that's a fantastic date to just mess with the history a little bit. Of course, obviously, the Soviet Union was cynically run, and it collapsed itself. So that's where it gets a bit silly. But 1987, Germany, tactical level, it's combined arms with tank-to-tank combat at the centre of it all. They do expansions of it. The advanced rules is where it's at. Don't bother with it if you're going to just play the standard rules. Quite opinionated. My explanation for this is as follows. It's done so well, why would you not? They've put so much effort into the advanced rules, into the stats cards, remembering every little bit. They're going for angles of the armour and hit locations on the tanks, and they've remembered all the ammunition types and all the various armour types and fire control systems, and they've got the air support in detail even, so you've even got detailed air support. So there you go, combined arms, and really helps with the German theme. So it's a great, there we are, there's a realistic place where something actually can break out, because, you know, say we move to nuclear war, we're going to maybe have some clashes in Germany at least before we go to nuclear war. So right on the contact line, nice for realism for a Cold War gets hot. And then we have expansions. So we have here Canadian forces, and as each of these expansions come, they put more tokens in for the Soviet Union, because of course historically, and I recommend ironically, on this subject, we're going a bit off topic, but this is just at least something closer to ultramodern. It's at least the bridging gap to my version of ultramodern, which is today, near past, near future. Once we get to about 87 technology, we're nicely in the ultramodern world, at least, or the beginnings of what made the foundation for it. And Canadian War Museum, fantastic for understanding the scale of the Soviet Union and NATO forces. So I recommend that. They have a great display on there, printed in red and blue models that shows you the scale of everything, the whole combined arms, how much naval assets they had in the works. So yes, there we are, like the Canadians mixing in with the NATO forces, and then we have the British. There we go, look, a British of the Rhine. Absolutely the case. Many people growing up here will remember all of that. And then finally we have West Germany, because of course we had the East-West German divide back then. So we have all of the forces that really were there on higher alert back then, right on the West and East German border. And we have the 1987 technology, and we have all of the detail in the military forces that are being used. So you could easily use micro armor and put that into the system and play the advanced rules and have all the stats with you there and play on the hex maps. So there's some interesting options for you as a sideline. But as I say, my recommendation for getting started in ultramodern for today's warfare, without faffing around about whose force looks to be accurately statted out, use me, Modern Warfare. Thanks for listening, and hope you enjoy. If you have any requests for particular videos or battle reports that you'd like to see me play, then just drop a comment in and I'll chat away to you all, because I normally check the channel when I can. Okay? Thanks everyone. Bye.